I have spoken around the world quite a bit, and I frequently get asked in the Q&A part of that. People will say, well, you've dealt with presidents and prime ministers and kings and so on over a long period of time, and who has made the greatest difference? And so I ruminate about Gorbachev and one person or another, and of course in the end come around to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and I get through talking about them, and I say, well, all things considered, I have to say Milton Friedman. And I think you all know, and you could give the reasons why you would say, all things considered, when it comes to really making a difference, it would be Milton. And I suspect that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher might give you the same answer, because they have been powerfully influenced by his ideas.
The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences asks you to step forward and receive from the hand of His Majesty the 1976 Nobel Memorial Prize.
Resistance, even contempt, plagued Friedman, not only when he received the Nobel Prize. Most intellectuals, even economists of his time, dismissed his work for ideological reasons.
Well, one has to understand that President Friedman would blame everything from the First World War to the invasions of Genghis Khan on monetary policy, and would use monetary policy as a cure for both. He's a one cause, one cure man.
I think Galbraith looked on the Chicago Economics Department and Friedman and the like with bemusement. I mean, I think that he felt that they were part of economics' past, not its future.
I think what helped Friedman get through this well were two personal characteristics that were very important. One, he's a tremendous optimist. The second one was his analysis was so clear and straightforward and simple that he believed that he was right on most of these issues and that the profession just hadn't analyzed them sufficiently. He was, considered an oddball in the profession, and his ideas were ridiculed by many people as being way out, as just supporting, the status quo, supporting big business. I'm sure it was very difficult on him personally and his wife, Rose.
His wife, Rose, a brilliant economist whom Milton was fortunate to discover at the University of Chicago, where he also found the second great love of his life, economics, as a discipline that can lead to great human improvement. Friedman was inspired by great teachers like Frank Knight, who laid the foundation of the Chicago School of Economics. Eventually, Friedman became its most famous proponent.
Look, he'd grown up, as I had, in a small town. He wasn't exposed to many of the things that a lot of other kids had been exposed to. And I guess that's one of the things that drew us together. We sort of came from the same background. And therefore, our ideas were pretty much the same. He was more intellectual than I was, but not too much.
She's a wonderful person. She's very warm and thoughtful and very much concerned with other people's welfare and not particularly our own.
He is the most tolerant, too much so, that I have ever known. And little of it has rubbed off on me, but not very much.
What I liked about it, I think, was that my father really believes in reason. If the child has the right argument and the parent has the wrong argument, then the parent has the same obligation to concede as the child does the other way around. And that was certainly one very important and attractive part of growing up in that family.
Before long, Friedman was recognized not only as a great creative economist, but also as an extraordinary teacher and skilled debater.
I think the impression you get is he loves to talk and he argues back and forth.
One of the reasons why I am in favor of less government is because when you have more government, industrialists take it over.
But if you pay attention, I think what he's doing is he's teaching.
Well, he was a great teacher. I always say he was the greatest teacher I ever had. He made economics come alive. It was not simply a game that clever academics played, but it was a way of understanding reality.
I remember doing a paper in which I said at one point, either A, this will happen, or B, that will happen. He wrote in the margin, or C, your analysis is wrong. And when I saw him afterwards, I said, where was my analysis wrong? He said, I didn't say your analysis was wrong. I just wanted you to keep that possibility in mind. So he was a tough one.
Joining us live from our San Francisco bureau is the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman.
And around the kitchen tables and in the living rooms of America.
It's often described as a profit system, but that's a misleading label. It's a profit and loss system.
One of the wonderful things about you is that when you speak, I almost always understand you, and that...
Mr. Friedman, your expertise as an economist is, of course, indisputable.
His appearances on national television have made him an unexpected celebrity.
The long-term national security of this country will not be promoted by converting the United States into a protected enclave, protected from foreign competition.
He also appeared frequently in print.
And I remember Katharine Graham of the Washington Post asking me to persuade Milton Friedman to be a columnist.
I was a little hesitant to do it. I wrote about 3 or 4 trial columns and tried them out to see whether I could do it. I wrote the column for 17 years, and I think that turned out to be one of the most important factors in enabling me to communicate to the public at large.
Bob Chichester, an educational TV producer, persuaded Milton and Rose Friedman to cooperate on a TV program, Free to Choose. It became a watershed in the understanding of economics by the American public. 3 years in production, Free to Choose illustrates Friedman's philosophy in new ways, easy to understand.
The other side of the world, in Japan,
thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil.
This is India today.
The free market enables people to go into any industry they want, to trade with whomever they want.
The principles of freedom, principles that are involved in free to choose, are those which are most applicable to advance human civilization. And you can't delve in a more important area than that.
Rose and Milton edited the soundtracks from the program into a best-selling book. Translated into 16 languages, including Hebrew, it sold millions of copies.
I remember the first time I encountered his ability to make you think was when I read the opening words of Capitalism and Freedom, which say that Kennedy's inaugural speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," is precisely wrong about the relationship between the citizen and the state. It was such a striking thought that I realized that I had to think these things through again. I'm not sure it's right, but it certainly makes you think. Milton had an influence on macroeconomic policy. He was the father of the monetarist school of monetary policy, which said that the key factor in controlling inflation is control of the quantity of money. This is a fact with regard to hyperinflations, with regard to high rates of inflation. And my great teacher, Paul Samuelson, who was not entirely in sync with Milton, said to his class, If you believe that smoking causes cancer, you'd better believe that money causes inflation. And that's the quality of the depth of the evidence that Milton brought.
The U.S. economy is fundamentally strong, but that strength is currently being eroded by the disease of inflation. If that disease is not checked, it will take a heavy toll, including, in my opinion, the very likely destruction of our personal, political, and economic freedom. Any cure would have to be painful indeed to be worse than letting that disease rage unchecked.
Milton's second, to my mind, great contribution, and perhaps the most lasting, was in his understanding of the role of government. He saw the trends towards the rising size of government, to greater involvement of the government in the economy, and he was very worried by the differences in the incentive systems that face politicians, where the spending is, where you do well if you can spend more money, and the incentives that face the private sector. And he was convinced that governments were likely to grow too big, and that would endanger the vitality and the resilience of the economies originally of the West. I would say that there he was very successful in some regards, certainly in changing awareness. He didn't stop the trend to larger government. It took place. But he certainly started the counter-movement, which took place under Reagan. Government didn't decline, but there was deregulation, which took place under Thatcher, and which exists in other countries, Australia, Hong Kong, etc. And that's a fight that is still ongoing, where his insights were tremendously important, still are tremendously important, and where his writings, again, are extremely persuasive. But there he doesn't just have to persuade central bankers and technicians, he has to persuade politicians, and that's harder.
We're all here today to present the Medal of Freedom to 8 remarkable Americans. The citation from Milton Friedman, teacher, scholar, and theorist. Milton Friedman restored common sense to the world of economics. It is for his celebration of the human spirit, as well as the brilliance of his mind, that I bestow upon Milton Friedman the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Friedman's strong support for free internal and international trade, his creative innovation of floating exchange rates, has brought about unprecedented economic growth, great prosperity and stability to many countries. Economic strength enabled the U.S. to win the Cold War. Friedman's ideas played an important role in saving the many millions of the Soviet Union from slavery and starvation.
There are various ways to describe Friedman's influence. One way is as has he helped many people, poor people in the world. And I just take India and China, 37% of the world's population. Hundreds of millions of people in these two countries who used to live on less than $1 a day or even $2 a day are now able to live at a much more decent standard of living as a result of the reform of their economic policies toward more free market policies, less regulation, less government, and the like. But there was one person who they're more indebted to than anybody else for their great improvement in their situation. In my judgment, that person is Milton Friedman.
Friedman was also the first to point out that it was the government's monopoly of education that resulted, in all democracies, in rapid educational deterioration. Friedman suggested as a remedy parental choice in education. Friedman proposed a voucher system whereby tax money designated for education will be channeled to schools through parents and not through the government's educational bureaucracy. Competition among schools for vouchers would lead to educational improvement. Milton and his wife Rose bequeathed much of their fortune to a foundation promoting educational choice.
It's a disgrace of the nation, in my opinion, that you should have the inner cities, which are the kind of hells. The schools in those areas turn out kids who can't read, who can't write, who can't figure. They have no economic future.
The full exercise of choice would invigorate the public school system, would improve it. Why? Competition always has that effect.
I had the great privilege of becoming not only Milton's informal student, but also a friend of his and his wife Rose. In 1987, he granted me and my colleague, Professor Stephen Plaut, an exclusive interview in which he related his impressions from his former visits and analyzed the many challenges facing Israel. Friedman recalled the 1962 meeting he had with the movers and shakers of the Israeli economy.
My most memorable experience there, which I recall with great vividness, is a meeting I held one morning with the people who were supposedly the movers and shakers in Israel. The head of the Histadrut, the head of your Manufacturers Association, the head of your Bankers Association, the head of the Agricultural Association. I don't know, maybe there were one or two others. There were about 6. And I got that meeting off to a very good start by starting out as follows. I said, gentlemen, the major problem with a sensible economic policy in Israel is you gentlemen. You are the people who are the greatest obstacle to a sensible economic policy. And unfortunately, I was right. Because every one of them was in favor of eliminating the restraints on everybody else, but wanted to keep them on himself. Let me say, that's a disease that is not restricted to Israel. The same thing is true in the United States. I believe that the greatest opponents to freeing the economy in the United States and in every other country are the merchants and manufacturers. And that's a view that I share with Adam Smith, who in 1776, in his great book, The Wealth of Nations, in speaking about the restraints on international trade, says it's obvious to every household that it's in the household's interest to buy goods where it can buy it most cheaply and to sell it where it can sell it most expensively. And nobody would ever have thought that that was wrong if it had not been, I don't guarantee the exact words, for the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers. And that remains no less true today than it did then.
Israel simply cannot have unemployment because unemployment will lead to emigration and will be something on the order of a national disaster. Is it true that liberalization of the Thatcher style or perhaps even of the New Zealand style must necessarily lead to an extended period of high unemployment?
What produces the unemployment is not the liberalization. What produces a temporary period of unemployment is almost always the attempt to reduce inflation. If you had no inflation, liberalization would add to employment, not reduce it. You mustn't confuse the two things. A free market is a market in which people have wider opportunities, in which they can get better wages, in which they have more opportunities for employment. But again, I want to emphasize to you, the major problem that Israel faces, in my opinion, is not inflation. The major problem Israel faces is socialism.
Israelis use the heavy burden of defense as an excuse for the many distortions in their economy and for their reluctance to liberalize their markets. Friedman had this to say.
If Israel has a strong defense problem, that means it needs as strong an economy as it can have. Surely the stronger the economy, the greater the defense burden you can afford to bear. And so the fact that Israel has to devote a great deal of its effort to defense surely means that it can't afford to waste its substance in all of these other boondoggles, all of these other false ventures that the government gets involved in. So that makes a stronger case and not a weaker case for freeing the market so that you can have the most efficient use of your resources, so you can have an economy which will attract people to come in rather than drive people out. How can anyone suppose that the way to be strong militarily is to establish an environment in which people have the best, the ablest, the brightest, the most productive people have a strong, they have to stay in only because of patriotism. Every economic motive drives them to go out. Now, how can you suppose that that's the way to have a economy that can be strong in defense?
The Friedmans visited Israel again in 1972 and in 1977 when Milton was given an honorary degree by the Hebrew University. Milton defined then the crucial choice facing Israel.
When I was in Israel for the first time, in middle 1960, 63 I think it was, and I came away, I summarized my conclusions about Israel by saying that there are two Israeli traditions at war in Israel. One of them is a 100-year-old tradition of democratic socialism. The other is a 2,000-year-old tradition coming out of the diaspora about how you get around government regulations. It's not enough for the older tradition to revive, because the extent of government intervention today is so great that what you need to do is to reduce that government intervention very much and very greatly.
The ever-curious Friedman was also intrigued by the role of Jews in civilization. He was particularly puzzled by the allure of socialism for so many Jewish intellectuals.
There are no people in the world who have benefited so much from capitalism as the Jews. And there are no people in the world who have done so much to undermine capitalism as the Jews. And the question is how you reconcile those two. It's an interesting thing, because take the argument you've made. What is it that enabled the Jews to exist over 2,000 years? It was profit. It was a profit system. It was a capitalist system. In which countries in the world do Jews do best? In those countries which are most hospitable to the profit system. So that it's absurd to say that somehow profit in that sense is a bad thing.
Maybe the Jews finally accepted the argument of their enemies that always accused them as profit-seeking, and therefore decided that their enemies were right and that it was what they were doing was obscene and was bad.
That was entirely, in my analysis of explanation of this paradox, I said that there were several explanations. One was the fact that in Europe in the 19th century, all of the so-called right-wing parties were religious parties. And they were connected with the established churches. And that the only parties then where Jews could find a home were the left-wing parties. That's a part of the explanation. But I said the major explanation is exactly what you suggest, that Jews wanted to demonstrate that they were not like the stereotype. Right. And therefore, they proceeded to make themselves into socialists.
By chance, the Friedman's 1977 visit took place shortly after the ruling Labour Party, Mapai, lost its almost 30-year grip on power. It was replaced by the right-wing coalition of Menachem Begin. Begin vowed to scrap the socialist policies of Labour that have so severely damaged Israel, and to replace them by a free market economy. Unfortunately, he replaced socialism by an equally damaging state control of the economy, extending the government's interference in the economy rather than diminishing it. Begin's pro-market rhetoric was exploited by the enemies of free markets to propagate a pernicious myth that Begin actually followed to the letter advice given to him by Friedman, and that this led to runaway inflation and the ruin of Israel's economy. Friedman recalled.
No, I wasn't invited. I have never been an advisor to the Israeli government in any sense other than as a concerned individual who was very much concerned with the state of Israel and who believed very strongly, as I do now, that Israel is being strangled by its socialist measures. While I was in Israel, it just happened accidentally. The date had been set long before, but it happened accidentally to come very shortly after the Begin government had come into office. And so while I was there, I did have meetings with various people in the government, including about a half an hour or three-quarters of an hour with Prime Minister Begin. I may say I was very much impressed by Begin, but I was also impressed with the fact that economics was a subject in which he had zero interest. Begin is not the only great man who has no feel whatsoever for economics. My favorite example is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was clearly a great man, but every time he touched an economic issue, he came down on the wrong side.
Milton and Rose wrote a book explaining why it was so difficult to institute pro-market reforms, ascribing the difficulties to the tyranny of the status quo.
You have the policies you have because of the tyranny of the status quo. When you have a government-controlled policy, you have three strong groups that develop by the policy. You have the direct beneficiaries of the policy, the manufacturers who receive a subsidy or the workers who are receiving a subsidy. You have the politicians who need to get campaign funds, need to get support from those beneficiaries, who have an interest in trying to accommodate the people who are supporting them. And then, third of all, you have the government bureaucrats who administer the program and who tend to have a vested interest in its continuation. So it is always very hard to make changes. A change inevitably hurts some people. Now, there's one thing that needs to be added to that. The people who are hurt by a change are generally know they will be hurt. They're generally visible. The people who will be helped by a change generally don't know that they would be helped. Here are people out there who have jobs, who would be able to have much better jobs in a freer economy, but they don't know it. How can they possibly know it? This is true in every country, again. And so the situation is that the immediate, present, and vocal and influential people are the people who would be hurt by a change, or the people who are seeking further benefits from the government, which are concentrated. The people who would be helped are diffuse, they're widespread, and they don't know it. And I believe the hope for Israel is that the dissatisfaction with by the public at large will become sufficiently great that there will be a political constituency formed for a candidate who proposes a major change in the structure of the society.
The Friedmans' last Israel visit was in 1990. They came to participate in a conference on economic policy organized by the Israel Center for Social and Economic Progress. Held at the beginning of the large wave of immigration from the former Soviet Union, the conference was devoted to the fashioning of better absorption policies and the provision of housing and jobs for immigrants. Milton lectured several times and participated in all the workshops that dealt with a variety of issues, demonstrating his brilliance, creativity, and good common sense. By then, the Friedmans had already developed a deep fondness for Israel, which they described on earlier visits as not only beautiful, but an incredibly diversified country surrounded on all sides by enemies.
People who say a small country, we can only attract foreign investment by giving them special privileges, by offering them tax advantages, are making Israel poorer, not richer. The way you can attract foreign investment is by making Israel what it should be, a haven for private enterprise, for free people to do the best they can with their own resources. The problem is, how do you make it politically feasible to do it? And I think there's only one way, and that's the way Daniel Doron has been following, by trying to persuade the public at large that that's the right thing to do. Sooner or later, the government will listen to the people. I believe that if Israel followed the right policies, instead of having to worry about how you're going to handle the necessitous immigrants, you'd be in a situation where you would have people trying to come into Israel, not being a burden, but bringing capital, bringing their abilities into Israel, to set up new enterprises, to take advantage of the opportunities which a free, private market Israel would offer. Thank you.
Milton remained intensely involved with Israel to his last days, offering help whenever he could. In support of the financial market reforms that the Israel Center for social and economic progress initiated, Friedman wrote in 2004 to then Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, lauding him for his courage in instituting the revolutionary reform in financial markets despite stiff opposition. He also wrote to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, congratulating him for his support for Netanyahu's vital reforms. Israel needs a competitive financial structure that favors private enterprise and initiative, not one that is rigid and monopolistic. Freeing up the economy and introducing effective competition will result in short-term stimulus as well as promote long-term growth.
Israel is a country that has great potential from it as an economy, but it is a case of arrested development. It's rich human capital. Its location at a spot in the center of the Middle East makes it a natural for a growing and prosperous economy. It has the potential of being the Hong Kong of the Middle East, but that potential has been arrested over the years. What has arrested it? Too rigid, too intrusive a government. The socialist policies which the government has followed. Israel can change that policy. It can change the situation by introducing a larger element of free market, free price system. One voice in the wilderness over the past few decades has been my friend Daniel Doron with his Israel Center. It has been the one group in Israel that has been preaching free markets, private property, private enterprise. Fortunately, currently, he has a strong ally within the government, Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who knows economics, understands the problem, and is prepared to use his political capital to see that he can bring it about.
In his own country, Milton Friedman remains the still controversial champion of the American dream.
Thank you all very much. It's an honor for me to be here to pay tribute to a hero of freedom, Milton Friedman. He has used a brilliant mind to advance a moral vision. That vision has changed America, and it is changing the world.
Now we know Milton's prowess as an intellect, as a theorist, but we also know, and has been brought out by earlier comments, how insistent he is that if you have a theory, you better test it with facts. And a theory that can't be tested better be reformulated so it can be tested. And you've got to bring the facts to bear. So I know, Milton, you're tone deaf, but it isn't going to bother you. I'm going to sing, but you won't know it. So here's my song, my methodological tribute. A fact without a theory is like a ship without a sail, is like a boat without a rudder, is like a kite without a tail.
We're better off than we were 50 years ago, but we stand on the shoulders of the people who went before.
The true test of any scholar's work is not what his contemporaries say, but what happens to his work in the next 25 or 50 years. And the thing that I will really be proud of is if some of the work I have done is still being cited in the textbooks long after I'm gone.